We recorded stories of siege survivors in communal flats like this.
The famine was horrible. There were moments I did not believe I would ever eat enough. It seemed that when I would eat as much as I want, there might be nothing as happy as that.
Famine is a familiar phenomenon for Russia. The famine in the Volga region in the days of Leo Tolstoy, then after the revolution. But the famine in Leningrad, it was an absolutely special phenomenon. This was the famine in a magnificent city, among palaces, mansions, and monuments. This was the famine which lasted for hundreds of days. The famine that fell upon us unawares. The famine which was not caused by poor yield, or not just by the war, but by two crimes. The crime of the fascists who organized the siege and aimed to destroy the city, to drive it into complete starvation, and the crimes of our authorities. This was the war which also penetrated the city, as the famine was the enemy planted by the fascists, the enemy which made itself at home in the city. Once I was walking with a roll, as I recall, through the village of Rybatska, and the following scene occurred. A Red Army man was transporting ammo boxes with ammo on a sleigh pulled by the horse. The load was heavy. The horse was walking. It tried to walk up the hill, but it could not make it. And no matter how hard he beat it, there was nothing he could do. The horse fell down. It fell, it was wriggling, and there was nothing he could do. And suddenly, as if from nowhere, people began to appear. Their shapes were utterly terrible for our time, but then this sight was familiar. Figures wrapped in some scarves, kerchiefs. You could not tell whether it was a man or a woman. They pounced on that horse. It was still alive. Then, with their knives, they began to cut pieces of flesh out of it. It wriggled, screamed. The young Red Army man was shouting. He even tried to fire his rifle up in the air, but he could do nothing. They literally, well, in some 20 to 30 minutes, just picked this horse bare. This was a horrid scene.
I am trying to keep my chin up. Fortunately, I am not so sad about food only. What could I do? Could I indeed lie in bed all day long, dreaming of catching a cat for dinner? And I desperately did not want to die.
The city was covered with clean snow. There are narrow paths between the snowbanks. Trackways were only in certain streets. Human corpses were lying. These were not collected so often. Some of them on sleds. Evidently, one did not manage to carry them to the cemetery. The city is somehow all blind, and there is silence. Only the ticking of the metronome is heard here and there from the loudspeakers. The water conduit was out of operation. A water tap and a washing basin was a useless accessory, just as the switch on the wall. These had gone long ago. So long ago ended the time when one could turn the switch and the light would flash up. The stoves did not work. The heating did not work. There were potbelly stoves. People would come home, take off their boots or shoes, and get into bed without taking their clothes off. This was a kind of a hole. in this icy room, this icy flat that they crawled into and slept.
The street was suddenly wider. It is difficult to explain. It might be because we were exhausted, or because of some vision, which had become somehow different in the people of the siege, and because there were very few pedestrians in the street.
The city was pitted with fires and conflagrations. I remember the house destroyed by the bombs somewhere at the corner of Mokhovoye and Piesta Street. A part of the house was cut off from the bombing, and the house looked as if opened up. I would even say somehow shamelessly. But I remember the interior of that flat on the 4th floor, a wardrobe wide open, swaying in the wind. Dresses were blown out of it. In many flats there were people lying, the people who starved to death. When one had to bury, they would just wrap the body in a sheet or blanket and took it on a sled to either the cemetery or just a place where dead bodies were piled up. The Church of the Savior of Blood and other places.
My son died. I dressed him in his best clothes, everything I had prepared for the newborn in the times of the peace, and put him on the lid of the piano. But I heard rustling. I realized it was a rat. I was so afraid it would disfigure the face of the baby. In the morning, when leaving to get the bread, at 5 o'clock, I would take him in my arms and went with the dead child to get my bread ration. And it was so for 6 days. On the 6th day, when I was returning with the bread, I heard the noise of the car which collected dead bodies. And close to my house, next to my balcony, there was a heap of dead bodies. I came up to this man and said, "Take my baby. I cannot bury him. I am hardly walking myself." I offered a bread ration to him. He put my hand aside. "Pray for the boy yourself. I will do as you ask." 010904. "Where are you taking him?" He says, "To the Piskarevko."
There was cannibalism in Leningrad. There was pillaging. They forged cards. All of it. Everything was being done. It was all there. Much of it we did not manage to tell in the book. I mean, we managed, but they would not let us. We were told this story. There was a mother, a daughter, and a son, a boy. Well, the boy starved to death. They were unable to bury him. Well, what could they do? She put him in the kitchen between the windows. It was winter. A week passes, then another. She saw her daughter was dying. There is famine. She has nothing to feed the girl. What could one do? She cut a piece from the boy's corpse and made soup. And so, day after day, she fed her son to her daughter. She made us promise we would not tell anybody. Her daughter is well now. We saw that daughter. She does not have the slightest idea how she survived. One may ask, should we judge this mother for cannibalism? How? What could have been done? Who would dare to judge her? Such things happened. And so, this is not cannibalism. This is hunger. A hunger which, a man cannot fight. Especially when it is all about hunger and love. The problem of death was generally an unfamiliar subject for the Soviet people. The feeling of death became sharp during the siege. Death was considered a taboo subject during Soviet times. It was not talked about. People were not preparing for it. It was something generally as if not inherent in a Soviet man. An unfamiliar phenomenon. To think about death, about what there is after death, and so on. And here, it was at home in the city. And people felt it approaching. Once, we were told a story about a master at a plant. He was a good sanderman, an experienced worker. Once he came to the shop manager and said, "I will not work today. In the afternoon, I will die." The manager said, "Come on, how could you know?" "I know for sure." He left, and indeed, after some time, his fellows from the workshop came and said he died. People knew their death. Death was just an accessory of a human life. All cats, all dogs, all pigeons were eaten in the city. Everything living was eaten. For many people, this was another tragedy. There was a breathtaking story of one woman about her dog. She kept going as long as she could, this woman, she could not imagine that she would eat it, but she felt it was a matter of her life. And she came to the man with whom she had arranged it. But what was most frightening in this story was that she left her dog there. It was a small dog, not even a big one. And started to go away, and the dog looked at her, turned around and stayed. She said it was like a stab in the heart for her. She said, "I walked out and realized that it had also realized everything, that it knew what was going on and did not follow. I ran home. It's all over. It had been killed." Rats disappeared from the city. There were no rats. We were told a weird story, some blood-curdling story, about how the rats were leaving the city. The famine would stop at nothing.
They sent us to look about the flats and find those who had to be evacuated. I walked into some house, a huge long corridor, lighted a small Christmas tree candle, opened the first door wide. There were corpses lying on the floor. Another room, the same picture. There were 3 or 4 such rooms. Finally, a weak voice was heard from one of the rooms. "Who's there? Come in. Welcome. Come in." I entered. There was an old man lying. The room was all packed with books. "Dear little thing, if you are a human being, please take my cards and go fetch the bread. I am too weak." He could not rise, even. I heated some water on the books and put hot water bottles around him, went out to buy the bread, and said he would be taken from the city the next day.
There was a black market in the city. There were lots of black markets. These were a special phenomenon. One could come across anything there. Diamonds, Paintings, marvelous paintings of the Russian masters, the paintings by Shishkin, Rubel, anybody at all. Yes, all these, some rarities, antiques. All these were exchanged for bread, a glass of cereal, a piece of sugar, or butter. Those who exchanged things from the siege victims were not doing this for their life. They did it for personal gain. In general, there were people in the city who were well off. As always, during a national disaster, somebody was thriving on it. That is why, for us, the siege has always been associated with crime. But this famine had its peculiarities, very unique peculiarities. As it was not just famine, it was famine under bombs and shells. The city was barraged and bombed every single day. This was famine with frost. This was famine in the dark. This was famine when people did not have water. Famine when there was no heating. And what does it mean? There was no water? What does it really mean, no water? It means people had to go to the Fontanka, Moika, Nevu rivers, to the closest ice hole. And what does it mean to go to the water hole? You take a bucket with a rope and you have to scoop. And the slope to the water hole is already covered with ice. And how do you get up with this bucket? And then you have to put this bucket on a sled, tie it, and then drag. Good if there is snow. And in the spring, drag it to your house, and then go up the stairs with this bucket. What is the siege staircase like? It is all icy with the sullage, which was just thrown on the stairs, the dirt and the garbage. How else? Toilets did not work. What about people? Where did they have to put it all? In the pots or china sets. This is terrible everyday life. I thought this siege, the siege of Leningrad, it all happened and was recorded in history not to ever let it happen again. Because these things cannot happen again. Nothing of the kind. Not long ago, my acquaintances from Yerevan came and told me everything that had been destroyed in the city. As people say, it's all fuel. Garden benches. They sawed down all the trees. There was nothing to heat the houses in the last winter. There was no fuel, and they burned everything. This is a picture of a besieged city. What does it mean walking past a fence in a siege? You walk past it and think whether you are strong enough to tear this board from the fence and take it home to saw in pieces. I recalled such an episode. A man was pulling a sled with dead bodies piled up like wood, like firewood. He was pulling this sled full of corpses, and there was an old woman walking after him, and she asked, "Darling, give me a lift." He said, "How can I give you a lift? Do you know where I'm going?" "Yes, I do." "Where am I going?" "To the cemetery." "Well, how could I give you a lift?" "Do give me a lift. I need to get to the cemetery." "Why do you need to go there?" "I lost my cards." "So what?" "I lost my cards. I will be dying, so I don't want too much trouble for my family. No unnecessary nuisance. You take me to the cemetery and I will die there." The lost card was a death sentence for a person. This person would be looked at as dead. People would stay away because this person was doomed. People would lose cards. You know, they were in such a state during the famine when both one's memory and one's attentiveness were becoming weaker, and cards would be stolen. In general, there were horrible scenes in the bakeries. And especially the boys from vocational schools who were caught in this siege. You know, they did not have their own homes. They lived in hostels. They had no stocks, nothing at all. They just got brutal as animals. They would pounce on people, steal their bread, and stuff it in their mouths. And here is a story. By Mishankina, I remember her. She told the story as she once came to the bakery and there was a fight. A fight. People were beating somebody. She asked what had happened. They were beating a boy because he had snatched bread. She said, "I knew what this meant. I started to beat him too. I was beating him and all of a sudden, I did not notice how. The bread was in my hands, his bread, the bread he had snatched from somebody, and I was already stuffing it in my mouth. I came to my senses only afterwards. What on earth, how on earth could this happen? What kind of fear was it? What horror. I ate that bread."
The most horrible time was at the end of December 1941. For 3 days, there was no bread in the shops, nothing whatsoever.
The famine created its own methods of surviving. They were very interesting. Here is the bread, the ration you were given. One piece of bread. How do you eat it? Some thought it should be fried, because then you could suck it for a long time. Others believed that it had to be divided into 3 parts. During the day, it means 24 hours. This would serve as breakfast, lunch, and supper. This small piece of bread. Everything was used. You know, here is a room of a siege survivor. A kitchen, everything. Drugs that were there. Maybe something could be eaten. A leather belt. People would think of a way to cook the belt. Books. Books are glued with casein glue. It meant one could scrub it from the book, let it soak, and eat it. Joiner's glue. This is hard to imagine what famine did to people, to what inventiveness it drove people, but also to what hopelessness. This famine discovered absolutely amazing capabilities in a human being, both moral and physical.